The morning light fell across the cobbles in the college quadrangle like a confession one could not quite make out. It was late April, and the air held that particular Oxford quietness that seemed less like the absence of noise and more like the memory of it. I had arrived early, too early, and the porter had not yet opened the side gate, so I stood beneath the great elm by the chapel, listening to the rain slide from branch to branch. The call had come the previous evening, just after I'd finished the crossword, or rather, failed it, since 5 down had refused all logic and lexicon. The chief superintendent's voice had the dull neutrality reserved for bad news, delivered too late to do any good. A death in college, nothing suspicious yet, but better to have a look. Better to have a look. I remember thinking how curiously that phrase excused all our trespasses. Inside, the quadrangle smelt faintly of wet stone and chalk dust. The staircase to the senior common room was narrow, its walls bruised with centuries of passing gowns. A young constable met me on the landing, too young, too earnest, too inclined to speak in full sentences. He told me the deceased was Dr. Francis Leland, fellow in classical history, found in his room that morning by the scout. He added that the man had apparently fallen, though he hesitated before the word, as if even gravity required further inquiry. I followed him inside. The room was orderly in that fragile way one finds among scholars, the desk lined with papers, books opened to half-read arguments, a cold pipe on the sill. Only the body broke the illusion of continuity. Leland lay by the fireplace, one arm bent beneath him, the other stretched outward, as if reaching for some invisible punctuation in the air. There was no struggle, no sign of intrusion. Only a single sheet of paper beside the chair, half charred by the dying coals. I bent down to look. A fragment of handwriting survived, faint but clear enough for a man accustomed to deciphering both Greek and gilt. And thus the silence becomes unbearable. I have often thought of that line, whether it was the end of a confession or the beginning of one. Lewis arrived half an hour later, dripping from the rain, his good humour too large for the smallness of the scene. He muttered something about academics and their tendency toward theatrical exits. I said nothing. Instead, I examined the bookshelves. Tacitus, Pliny, a scattering of detective novels that looked as though they'd been read only when nothing else would do. One volume had been placed out of order. It was the sort of detail only boredom notices, but boredom can be as revealing as curiosity. The title, Lives of the 12 Caesars, had been replaced with a study in scarlet. Beneath it, a thin layer of dust had been disturbed, as though the book had been removed recently. I took it down, felt its weight, and opened it. Inside was an envelope, unsealed, addressed not to anyone in particular, but to a phrase, the one who remembers. I slid it back. There are times one must not rush to interpret meaning, for fear it might vanish under too much light. The coroner's men carried the body out just before noon. The college bell tolled once, unnecessarily. A few students paused by the cloisters, whispering that the old man had been ill. He had not been. I had seen the medical records. But rumours require neither evidence nor accuracy. They thrive on the same silence that kills truth slowly. Before I left, I stood once more by the window. Across the courtyard, a figure watched from an upper corridor, a woman in a grey coat, still as a thought, half remembered. When our eyes met, she turned away. It was a small gesture, almost courteous, but it held the faintest echo of recognition. Lewis asked if we should question her. I told him no, there would be time enough for questions later. For now, I preferred to listen to the rain against the glass, the faint ticking of the clock, and the silence that seemed to grow heavier with every breath. That evening, I returned to my flat in North Oxford. The crossword still lay on the arm of the chair, The unsolved clue waiting like a rebuke. 5 down 6 letters meaning something that endures when all else fails. I wrote the answer without hesitation this time. Memory. There are certain churches in Oxford that seem to remember what the people in them have long forgotten. St. Swithin's was one of those small, half-ruined, and perpetually damp, its bell tower leaning like a tired academic, the air heavy with the smell of old hymnals and something faintly burnt. It was Lewis who first remarked upon the scent. He said it smelt like incense. I told him it smelt like guilt. He didn't reply, but I noticed the way his eyes followed the soot marks above the altar, a crooked fan of grey against the flaking plaster. The fire had been minor, at least by the standards of those who liked their tragedies obvious. A small blaze in the vestry, caught early, no injuries. Yet the vicar, a thin, uncertain man named Pike, had insisted on a police presence. Someone had been inside after hours, he said, though the lock showed no damage. Nothing had been stolen, except, perhaps, peace. I walked slowly through the nave, the echo of my footsteps caught in the hollow of the roof. The pews still held the faint outline of hymn books long removed, like shadows reluctant to leave. The air was sharp with the faint, acrid trace of something recently extinguished. Lewis busied himself with the fire report. I watched the light filter through the stained glass, the red and gold panes casting fractured halos across the blackened wood. One figure, St. Michael, had lost half his face to the heat, the other half still looking heavenward, as if in disbelief at his own endurance. Vicar Pike approached, his shoes squeaking against the stone. He said he'd been cataloguing church records in his study when the smoke alarm had gone off. He spoke with the weary conviction of a man who expected disbelief. I asked him what had been kept in the vestry. He said old vestments, candles, and the register a record of burials stretching back to the 17th century. Was it damaged? I asked. He hesitated. Not all of it. In the half-burnt cupboard we found what remained blackened parchment, brittle at the touch. Names faded, others obliterated entirely. One, however, was clear. The last entry before the fire, Eleanor Leland. I traced the date, 2 weeks earlier. Lewis said it must be a coincidence, the name. But I remembered the woman in the grey coat by the college window, the one who had turned away when our eyes met. Eleanor Leland, sister, wife, daughter, perhaps nothing at all, and yet coincidence has a habit of waiting patiently until one stops believing in it. On the desk beside the register lay a small key, warped by heat. I asked Pike what it unlocked. He said he didn't know that it had always been there. People in Oxford often say that. Things are always just their books, memories, grief, as though permanence absolved curiosity. Outside, the rain began again, insistent and fine. I stood beneath the porch, watching the graveyard darken. Names worn to anonymity, moss reclaiming the forgotten. Lewis spoke about needing to interview the caretaker, and I nodded, though my attention was on a small patch of disturbed soil near the boundary wall. It wasn't fresh enough to be recent, but it wasn't old either. I crouched down, ran a finger through the earth, ash mixed with soil. Not the light grey of burnt wood, but darker paper, perhaps. Something written, destroyed, buried again. Later in the car, Lewis said I'd gone quiet. I told him the church reminded me of a crossword I'd once abandoned too many blanks, not enough faith in the clues. He smiled in that way that meant he understood less than he wished to, but more than he should. That night, back in my flat, I looked up, St. Swithin. Patron saint of rain, of course. I poured a small measure of whiskey and sat by the window, listening to the drizzle gather in the gutters. Somewhere a bell chimed the half-hour hesitant, uneven. In the fire report, I'd noticed a trivial detail. The alarm had been triggered not at the vestry door, but from the pulpit censer 10 feet away from the blaze. Someone had walked there first, lingered perhaps, then left the flame behind like a question half asked. The ashes, the register, the name are all fragments of a sentence waiting to be spoken, and I could not shake the feeling that the silence of St. Swithin's was not the silence of peace, but of someone who had decided at last to stop pretending. The morning after St. Swithin's, Oxford felt drained of colour, as though someone had drawn a veil across its spires and left only the faint gleam of memory. I walked through the college gates with the particular heaviness that comes from thinking too much about the dead and too little about the living. Lewis was already there, speaking to the bursar, a man whose politeness seemed carved rather than grown. He spoke of Dr. Leland with the reverence reserved for the recently departed and the inconveniently brilliant. I gathered that Leland had been due to deliver a paper on some obscure Roman correspondence, a lecture that would now remain unwritten, like most of what matters. The bursar mentioned a small reception planned in his honour. He hoped I would consider attending. I told him I would think about it, though I knew I wouldn't. Lewis and I took the long route back to Leland's rooms, across the cloisters where the echo of footsteps always arrived a second too late. There was something about the rhythm that echoed the way it faltered near the chapel door that brought back the image of Eleanor Leland's name, the burnt register, the key twisted by flame. Patterns, perhaps, or just my fondness for inventing them. In Leland's study, the books still stood obediently in their rows, waiting for someone who would never return. The room held a stale kind of silence, the kind that accumulates after weeks of too much thought and too little speech. I noticed a fresh set of footprints in the dust by the desk. They were small, careful, and recent. Lewis swore under his breath. He asked if the crime scene had been secured. I said nothing. Whoever had been here had come looking for something, and had found it, or failed to. Either way, they had known where to look. The book with the hidden envelope was gone. We questioned the porter, an old man whose manner was half loyalty, half forgetfulness. He insisted that no one had been allowed entry, but his eyes betrayed that small hesitation familiar to anyone who's lied for good reason. He mentioned that a woman he thought perhaps Mrs. Leland had come the evening before to collect a few of her brother's papers. A sympathetic gesture, he said, though his tone carried a tremor of doubt. Lewis wrote it down. I pretended not to care, though my pulse quickened at the thought of her moving quietly through these corridors, gathering fragments of a life that had already begun to decay. We returned to the quad. Rain was falling again, a soft, persistent drizzle that turned the cobblestones to glass. I watched a group of undergraduates hurry toward the library, books clutched like shields against the weather. Their laughter floated briefly, then vanished under the grey sky. Youth, I thought, has the cruelty of never believing it will end. Later I found myself in the Bodleian, that cathedral of whispers. The librarian greeted me with the weary affection of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by my visits. I asked for the Leland archive, his lecture notes, correspondence, anything left behind. She frowned but fetched a small box. Inside, amid the dust and dried ink, I found a single postcard. It bore no address, just a line in Latin, Memoria flamma est. Memory is fire, a strange echo of the ashes at St. Swithin's. Coincidence again, perhaps, though coincidence has a remarkable way of following the same people twice. As I left, I paused by one of the reading desks. A student was sketching something absent-mindedly in the margin of a notebook, a pattern of interlocking keys. The shape was familiar, though I couldn't at first recall why. Then it came to me with the same curve and notch as the burnt key from the vestry. It was, I told myself, impossible. And yet, that night I dreamt of corridors endless, lamplit, full of voices I could almost recognize. I woke to the sound of rain against the window, and the soft ticking of the clock, the hour hand hovering near 3. I rose, poured a measure of whiskey, and sat in the half-dark. In the file on my desk, Eleanor Leland's name gleamed faintly from the coroner's list. Next to it, under next of kin, was a small annotation address unknown. I thought of the churchyard, of the soil that had not yet settled, and of the word Eleanor had chosen to inscribe in the fire silence. And it struck me, not for the first time, that in Oxford the dead never really go away. They simply learn how to whisper more convincingly. There are few things in Oxford more deceptive than a quiet library. Beneath its calm lies an unspoken turmoil, rivalries over footnotes, obsessions over commas, and the long, slow decay of those who have lived too long among words. It was mid-afternoon when I returned to Leland's old college to examine his manuscripts. The porter, that same old sentry of forgotten truths, seemed reluctant to see me again. He said the papers had been moved to the reading room for safekeeping. Safekeeping? An irony I let pass without comment. The manuscripts were bound in cheap leather, their pages crowded with Latin quotations, marginalia and occasional English notes, so terse they felt like afterthoughts to some private agony. One page in particular caught my attention. In the margin, beside a translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, Leland had written a single word, forgive. The ink was darker, fresher than the rest. I traced the faint indentation beneath the word, a small groove, as if the nib had hesitated before pressing down. Lewis, who had arrived late and smelled faintly of coffee, asked if I'd found anything. I said perhaps. He took this as meaning no. He moved toward the window, his figure blurred by the pale light. He said he'd spoken to one of Leland's colleagues, a Dr. Fairfax, historian of early Christianity. A nervous man, he said, who'd mentioned that Leland had been acting strangely in the days before his death, sleepless, withdrawn, often seen walking near St. Swithin's at odd hours. I asked if Fairfax had said why. Lewis shrugged. Something about unfinished work. Something about confession. That word confession stayed with me longer than it should have. There is a peculiar melancholy in the notion of confession, the belief that saying a thing aloud can somehow absolve it. I have seen too many lives unravel on that fragile hope. I turned back to the manuscripts. On the final page was a scrap of parchment glued into the binding, almost invisible. It bore a half-erased line from Seneca quis custodiet ipsos custodis. Who will guard the guards themselves? Below it in Leland's hand, another note. The answer lies with the one who reads too much. I looked around the reading room, then the bent heads, the faint coughs, the soft shuffling of pages. The air carried the scent of dust, lamp oil, and human solitude. If ever there were a place for secrets to grow unnoticed, it was here. Lewis asked what it meant. I said it was a warning, though I wasn't sure for whom. He smiled that half-resigned smile of a man who still preferred plain crimes to poetic ones. He asked if I'd ever considered that some clues were meant to mislead, to lead us not toward truth but away from it. I told him most are. Before leaving, I checked the borrowing register. Leland's last recorded loan was a book on Roman burial rites. It had been returned, curiously, the day after his death. The signature was smudged, but I could make out the first letter, E. Outside, dusk was dissolving over the rooftops. The rain had stopped, leaving a faint scent of wet paper in the air. Across the quad, a figure in a grey coat crossed the cloisters slowly, deliberately, her face hidden by the tilt of an umbrella. I thought for a moment to follow, but something held me back. Some mysteries, I have learned, reveal themselves only when one stops chasing them. That evening, back in my flat, I laid the page with the word "forgive" beside my crossword. 7 down 6 letters, something that haunts even the innocent. I filled it in almost absently. Regret. Later, as the clock struck midnight, I opened Leland's note once more and found what I had missed before: faint pencil marks beneath the ink, as if another word had been written there first and erased. Under a slant of light, it became clear. The word had been remembered. Forgive had been written over it. It was then, I think, that I began to understand that what Leland had sought was not forgiveness at all. It was the far crueler wish to be remembered by someone who no longer could. There are moments in an investigation when one begins to sense that the truth is no longer waiting to be discovered but quietly watching from somewhere behind the glass. That morning at the college I felt keenly that peculiar pressure of being observed not by the living but by the unspoken. The porter had called again, saying there had been someone seen in Dr. Leland's rooms the previous night. He had not gone to investigate, of course. Curiosity, in Oxford, is often smothered by tradition. I went alone. The staircase smelled faintly of polish and decay, the scent of old institutions clinging to every banister. I let myself in with the key we'd retained from the coroner's visit. The air was colder than it should have been, curtains drawn, dust unsettled. The faintest trace of perfume is something light, floral, entirely at odds with the room's austerity. I walked to the window. It overlooked the chapel courtyard, the same window from which I had once seen a woman in a grey coat looking back at me. The pane bore a faint smudge, the kind left by fingertips resting too long. I pressed my palm against it, feeling the lingering coolness. There was a sound then, not loud, but deliberate, from the adjoining study. A drawer closing, or something softer. I turned, waited, and said nothing. Silence settled once more, layered and absolute. I almost began to believe I had imagined it, as one sometimes does in these old rooms that seem to breathe on their own. On Leland's desk I found a single sheet of paper placed neatly atop the blotter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, smaller, more deliberate. A line from Tennyson. She would not turn her head to see the silver willows sleep. No signature, no explanation. Lewis arrived half an hour later, his usual blend of irritation and concern. He asked if I was sure someone had been there. I told him yes, though I no longer trusted my own certainty. He looked at the poem, frowned, and said it sounded romantic. I said it sounded final. He suggested handwriting analysis, and I suggested patience. The afternoon slipped toward evening. We spoke to the college housekeeper, a woman with the weary dignity of those who know more than they say. She remembered Eleanor Leland. Said she had visited her brother often, though less so of late. Kind woman, she said. Too kind. It was not meant kindly. I asked if Eleanor had ever stayed overnight. The housekeeper paused. Once, she said, but years ago, during the renovations when her brother was ill. She'd taken the rooms overlooking the quad, the very ones now empty, the ones that faced Leland's study window. After she left, I returned alone to those rooms. The door yielded with a soft groan. They were bare except for an old writing desk, a cracked mirror, and a single chair by the window. Dust lay thick, but the desk had been wiped clean recently, carefully. In the drawer, folded beneath a scrap of linen, was a notebook. The first pages were academic in tone notes on medieval burial customs, marginalia in Latin, but as I turned the leaves, the writing grew erratic, more personal, names blurred into confessions. One passage caught my eye. He says the past cannot burn twice, but it does. Every night it burns again. The entry was unsigned, though the looping hand matched the Tennyson note. I sat for some time by that window, staring at the opposite rooms where Leland had lived and died. From here, the line of sight was perfect. Anyone sitting in this chair could have watched him without ever being seen. Outside, the chapel bell began its slow tolling. Dusk pooled between the cloisters. I thought of the ashes at St. Swithin's, of the key twisted by flame, of the faint perfume that refused to fade. Patterns were forming, delicate, imperfect, and dangerous to name too soon. Lewis found me there much later. He asked what I was looking at. I said the window. He asked what I saw. I said perhaps nothing at all. But that night, as I sat in my flat, the word forgive still on my desk beside the crossword, I found myself returning again and again to the view from that window, the symmetry of it, the loneliness of it. 2 rooms divided by air and silence, each containing someone who had once believed the other could be understood. And I began to suspect that what bound Eleanor and her brother was not grief nor guilt, but the crueler bond of recognition, that each had seen too much of themselves reflected in the other and had turned away only when it was already far too late. There are times when a case ceases to feel like a pursuit of truth and becomes instead a dialogue with one's own misjudgments. That week was such a time. I had begun to suspect that what I sought had little to do with the dead and everything to do with what they had left unsaid. The morning began, as most do, with the crossword and a sense of quiet irritation at the state of humanity. I had filled in half the grid before noticing the pattern of the clues. Too many dealt with concealment covering, mask, hidden layer. I looked again, this time more carefully. The setter was someone I knew. The pseudonym matched one Leland had used in a magazine years before. Whether it was coincidence or mockery, I couldn't tell. Lewis arrived soon after, his face flushed with the satisfaction of small certainties. He said the lab had matched the handwriting on the Tennyson note to Eleanor Leland. He seemed almost pleased, as though the universe had finally offered him something solid. I said only that handwriting was not the truth, merely its imitation. We drove through the drizzle to her address, a small flat above a florist's in Jericho, its windows clouded with condensation. She answered the door before I knocked, as though she had been expecting the rhythm of my footsteps. Her manner was calm, almost rehearsed. She spoke of her brother with that curious blend of affection and accusation found only among those bound by blood. She said Francis had been unwell, though not physically, that he had become obsessed with the past, their childhood, their parents' grave, the notion that history could be rewritten if one were willing to burn the right page. I asked about St. Swithin's. Her eyes lowered. She said the church had meant something to him once, though what exactly she never learned. Lewis asked if she had visited the college recently. She hesitated only slightly before saying yes, to collect his papers. I watched her hands as she spoke gracefully, precisely, and noticed the faint stain of ink on her thumb. A scholar's mark, or a confession in miniature. When she left the room to fetch tea, I glanced at the piano by the window. On the stand lay an open score of Schubert, the slow movement from the B-flat sonata, its margins filled with notes in pencil, not musical ones, phrases, fragments, cryptic references. One read, "Silence is the only music left to us." Lewis, ever literal, asked if I thought it meant anything. I told him everything meant something. The question was only when. Back at the station, I studied the crossword again. One clue remained unsolved, 7 letters that bind 2 halves into one. I tried all the usual suspects: closure, unity, harmony, none fit. Then by chance I noticed the intersecting letters from previous answers formed the word mirror. It felt too deliberate to be accidental, a reflection, then perhaps the kind that deceives more than it reveals. That night, unable to sleep, I returned to the file on Leland's lectures. Among his notes was a small index card, one I had overlooked. On it, in faint pencil, he had written, "The truth is only ever symmetrical to those who stand far enough away." A strange thought, and not without irony. I thought again of Eleanor's window facing her brothers, of their silent correspondence across the quadrangle of two halves bound not by affection, but by the fear of resemblance. Mirror. The word returned, unwanted and absolute. By midnight I poured another whiskey and stared at the crossword. Lewis would have told me to let it go, to be content with evidence, signatures, reports. But it isn't evidence that keeps a man awake. It's the suspicion that what he missed was not a fact but a feeling. Before turning out the light, I filled in the final clue. Mirror. The pen hesitated as though reluctant to commit. Beneath the grid, in the setter's small italic hand, was the customary quotation. I hadn't noticed it before. All puzzles, when solved, reveal only the shape of their solver. I closed the paper, folded it once, and thought not for the first time that perhaps the dead were merely the cleverest among us, having at last solved theirs. It was late October by then, and Oxford had taken on that bruised, half-dying beauty that always made me uneasy, the kind of weather where the mist clings to the spires as if afraid to fall. Lewis had gone to fetch the preliminary reports, but I stayed behind at the college, not from diligence, though that was the reason I gave him, but because something in that place still refused to let me go. The librarian, a woman with the soft authority of those who had long ago learned that silence commands more than speech, met me at the entrance to the archives. She said she'd been expecting me. Her tone suggested she wasn't pleased by it. I asked about the Leland manuscripts, the ones catalogued years before under unpublished lectures. She frowned, consulted her ledger, and found nothing. Not misplaced, not missing, simply absent, as though they had never existed. Yet I had seen one. Held it, in fact, the afternoon before the inquest. A bound folder with his name on the spine, written in his small, angular script, inside translations, notes, marginalia, the kind of half-finished brilliance one associates with men who die too soon or not soon enough. I told her this. She said records do not vanish, only the people who keep them. Her words lingered longer than they should have. I searched the shelves myself, walking slowly along the narrow aisles, the dust rising in soft clouds like half-remembered thoughts. Somewhere between the stacks, I felt the peculiar sensation of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I've known that kind of company too well to mistake it, but something quieter, like the weight of an unseen gaze behind glass. I turned. No one. Only the faint creak of timber and the soft tick of the heating pipes. But on the desk near the window lay a book that hadn't been there moments before. Leland's collected essays on Roman mythology. I opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. One line only, written in pencil. What is lost was never truly owned. Lewis would later insist it must have been a student prank or the afterthought of an academic too sentimental to discard a scrap of Leland's melancholy. I wasn't so sure. There was something deliberate about the phrasing, an echo of the same hand that had once written Memoria flamma est. Memory is fire. I took the paper, folded it carefully into my notebook, and left. Outside, the quadrangle shimmered faintly with drizzle. A group of students passed by, laughing too loudly, the sound briefly shattering the stillness. I envied them their ease, their unawareness of how quickly meaning corrodes once one begins to seek it. At the lodge, the porter stopped me. He said a letter had arrived that morning, hand-delivered. No return address. I opened it in the car, a single page, blank, except for 3 words, typed neatly at the centre, "Ask about Fairfax." I remembered the name, the colleague who had described Leland as troubled, the historian of early Christianity with a talent for avoidance. I found him in his room at St. Cuthbert's later that evening. The door opened slowly, revealing a man hollowed by insomnia and too much truth. He said he hadn't seen Leland in weeks before his death, that their friendship had ended over a disagreement about a manuscript, yes, but nothing important. I asked what kind. He said theological. Then, seeing my expression, he added that it was purely speculative, an attempt by Leland to reconcile ancient myth with moral doctrine. Dangerous, perhaps, but harmless. He said this last word with a tremor that betrayed its opposite. On his desk lay a stack of old carbon copies. I noticed the top sheet bore faint traces of another document once typed, over it reversed letters pressed into the paper. I tilted it toward the lamplight and read them slowly backward. Swithin. He noticed me looking and reached for the papers too quickly. I let him take them. There was no need to press further. The truth, I had learned, grows skittish under interrogation. That night, walking backs, along the high street, the city glowed faintly beneath the drizzle, all bronze reflections and blurred lamplight. The bells of Magdalen struck 10, slow and uneven. I found myself thinking again of the missing manuscript of words erased not by carelessness, but by choice. Somewhere, perhaps in a locked drawer or a burning hearth, the truth had been folded neatly out of existence. Not lost, merely unwritten. And in that vanishing act of that quiet, deliberate erasure, I felt the first tremor of understanding that the manuscript I sought might never have been meant to exist at all. The church was almost empty when I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, grey and unremarkable, the kind of day that lends itself too easily to reflection. St. Swithin's had been scrubbed and restored since the fire. Even the scorch marks above the altar had been plastered over, as if forgiveness could be painted on. Vicar Pike greeted me with that unease peculiar to men who suspect that truth is an uninvited guest. He said the insurance men had been, that all was accounted for. I told him I doubted that. He didn't ask why. Few people ever did. The church smelt of polish and candle smoke, though beneath it lingered something older, the faint trace of damp parchment and moulded hymnals. I asked to see the vestry again. He hesitated, but I imagined something in my expression discouraged refusal. The cupboard that had held the burial register was now empty, newly built. But on the sill above it, the soot had not been fully cleaned. I ran a finger along the surface. Beneath the black, a faint impression of letters appeared reversed, incomplete, but enough to decipher a single word, Eleanor. Pike watched me closely. He said her name softly as though afraid it might echo. He remembered her visits, her questions about her brother's research, and her sudden disappearance after his death. He claimed she had come to pray for him. I asked if she had left anything behind. He said no, then looked away too quickly. Outside the vestry window, the graveyard lay still under a veil of mist, the headstones tilted like listeners straining for some final sermon. Somewhere beyond the wall, a bell from another parish rang for half an hour. Lewis arrived with a file under his arm, muttering about bureaucracy and coffee. He said the forensics report on the burnt papers had come back. Most were unidentifiable, but one fragment contained a line from the Gospel of John, "And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not." He said it was probably a coincidence. I said there were too many of those already. We left Pike standing in the doorway, his eyes following us, as though unsure which of us he ought to fear more. Back in the car, Lewis asked what I thought of the vicar. I said he believed in redemption, but not the truth. He said that was unfair. I said it was Oxford. That evening, I walked to my usual pub on Walton Street, half empty, dimly lit, the kind of place where memory could sit unnoticed in the corner. I took my drink to the back table, opened my notebook, and reread the line from the burnt register. Eleanor Leland, interred 12th of the April. 2 weeks before the brother's death, but there had been no record of any burial, no death certificate. The reverent lie, I thought, the kind that hides grief beneath ritual. A man from the college entered then, Dr. Fairfax, the scholar of early Christianity. He looked different now, more composed, perhaps even relieved. He spotted me and hesitated before approaching. I told him he needn't. He came anyway. He said he'd been thinking about our last conversation. Leland had spoken to him shortly before the fire that he had been frightened not of death, but of discovery. Fairfax had dismissed it at the time as academic paranoia. But now, he said, he wasn't so sure. He reached into his coat and placed a small notebook on the table. It was bound in the same maroon leather as the missing manuscript. He said it wasn't the real thing, just Leland's notes, the fragments he'd copied. He had kept them all this time, out of guilt perhaps, or fear. I opened it carefully. The writing was faded, erratic, but one phrase stood out, circled several times. "The church will keep the secret if I cannot." When I looked up, Fairfax was gone. The notebook remained, faintly smelling of smoke. Later, in my flat, I read through it again. Leland had been tracing an old legend, a heretical text, hidden within the parish archives of St. Swithin's, one that challenged the sanctity of the very doctrine it preserved, a manuscript that, if revealed, would have ruined reputations, perhaps even faith itself. But there was something else, a marginal note in Eleanor's handwriting, unmistakable. He was right to burn it. I closed the book and poured another whiskey. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the wet pavements, reflections trembling like confessions half withheld. Some truths, I thought, are too sacred to survive revelation. And some lies the reverent ones endure because they are kinder than the facts they conceal. I slept poorly that night. In the small hours, I woke to the sound of rain against the window and the faint tolling of a distant bell. For a moment, I thought I saw the outline of a figure standing across the street, watching from beneath an umbrella. Then it was gone, leaving only the dark glass and my own reflection, a man who could no longer tell which was which. It had rained during the night, the kind of steady, unrepentant rain that leaves Oxford smelling of wet stone and iron. By morning, the air had turned sharp, metallic, the kind of air that made you feel the city was holding its breath. Lewis and I stood beside what was left of a car parked behind the vicarage at St. Swithin's. It was blackened, skeletal, the heat having eaten the paint clean from the metal. The constable on duty said it had gone up just before dawn. No witnesses. No survivors, though. None were expected. Lewis wrinkled his nose. The smell of petrol lingered, sweet, nauseating, absolute. He said arson, I said memory. He looked at me as if I'd spoken Latin, which in a sense I had. The fire brigade had finished their work by the time we arrived. The vicar stood nearby, wrapped in a blanket as though to protect him from his own thoughts. His face had lost its composure, the expression of a man who had tried to keep faith with both God and the world, and discovered the two were rarely on speaking terms. He said the car belonged to Dr. Fairfax, that he had come late last night, distraught, asking to see the church one final time. He had given Pike a set of keys, one for the vestry, one for his study, and had spoken of a manuscript, something that needed to be destroyed before others found it. Pike had refused to help. Fairfax had left soon after. No one saw him again. Lewis glanced toward the ruins. He said nothing, but the question hung between us. I nodded. The fire investigators found what they called remnants of personal effects in the driver's seat. Rings fused to metal, bone reduced to pale dust. They were almost certain. Almost. We spent the rest of the morning in silence, the sort that grows thicker with every word unspoken. By noon, the rain had stopped, and the sun had begun to push its weak light across the rooftops. I remember the way it caught the puddles like light, trying to forgive what it had seen. At the station, Lewis went through the notes again, the burnt car, the missing manuscript, Eleanor's name in the register. He said it made sense now Fairfax had been guilty and had wanted to hide what he and Leland had done. I told him sense was a dangerous thing in Oxford. It tended to replace truth far too easily. In Leland's notebook I found a small reference I had overlooked before a line written in faint ink beside a passage on ritual fire. Ignis probat aurum, fire tests gold. Beneath it, another in different handwriting, and faith tests the rest of us. The next day I visited Eleanor's flat again. It was empty. The piano lid was closed, the chair pushed neatly beneath it. On the windowsill a glass of water stood untouched, a film of dust already forming on its surface. On the kitchen counter a single envelope lay beneath the light. No address. Inside, a photograph of the ruins of St. Swithin's, taken years before the fire, and on the back, in faint pencil, it was never about forgiveness. I left the flat without taking it. Some things are not evidence, they're epitaphs. That evening I drove back through the city. The streets gleamed under the street lamps, slick and indifferent. I parked outside the church and sat for a long time, listening to the ticking of the engine cooling. The smell of petrol still hung in the air, carried on the damp wind. Lewis would have called it closure. A man consumed by guilt, a woman vanishing into silence, a case wrapped neatly in soot and supposition. But I knew better. I knew the difference between truth and its residue. There was one final detail that refused to rest. The fire report listed traces of petrol not only in the car, but near the vestry door, 2 ignition points, one deliberate, one not. As I walked through the graveyard, the fog began to rise again. The church loomed ahead, patient, inscrutable. I thought of Fairfax's words, his terror, his insistence that the manuscript must burn, and I wondered whether he had ever truly meant the pages. The rain began again, soft at first, then harder, washing the scent of petrol into the earth. I stood there until it was gone, until all that was left was the faint smell of ash and something older, something I could not name. And in that moment I realized that Oxford, for all its knowledge and grace, was a city built not on truth, but on the careful, reverent management of its lies. It was a strange sort of dawn, pale, reluctant, as if the light itself doubted the wisdom of returning. I had not slept. The smell of smoke had followed me home, threading itself into the folds of my coat, the fibres of the curtains, even the whiskey glass left half-finished beside the armchair. Some odours never leave you, they become part of your thinking. The case, if that word still applied, had turned to ash. The reports, the interviews, the endless speculations, all burned down to a single ember that refused to die. It was not the manuscript, nor the fire, nor even the question of who struck the match. It was the silence that followed, deliberate, disciplined, almost devout. Lewis came by early, bringing coffee and the kind of optimism only the well-rested can afford. He said the coroner had confirmed Fairfax's identity, dental records. I said nothing. He said they'd found traces of accelerant on his shoes, as if that settled it. I told him guilt and evidence were rarely the same thing. He sighed, that quiet exhalation of a man who knows his superior will never be content with endings that make sense. After he left, I walked to St. Swithin's one final time. The air was heavy with damp, the kind that blurred the outlines of things: graves, windows, conscience. The church stood quiet, restored to order, as though the past weeks had been no more than an academic inconvenience. Inside, the light fell in weak shafts through the stained glass, scattering across the polished pews like the remnants of a broken argument. I found Vicar Pike by the altar, polishing a brass candlestick. He looked older, though perhaps it was only the morning light showing him without his habitual authority. He said he hadn't expected to see me again. I said I hadn't expected to come. We stood for a moment, the air between us crowded with all that neither of us wished to name. I asked about the keys Fairfax had left him. He hesitated, then withdrew them from his cassock pocket. Two of them, identical except for one detail, the smaller of the two was warped, half melted, the metal blackened by heat. He said he'd meant to hand them over, but something had stopped him. He couldn't say what. I turned the keys in my hand. On the ring was a small brass tag, the kind used in old archive drawers. It bore a single word, sanctum, a Latin relic meaning both holy place and secret chamber. I thought of the burnt cupboard, the erased register, the missing manuscript. The connection came quietly, without triumph. There had never been a manuscript in any real sense. It was a metaphor, a confession disguised as scholarship. Fairfax had not burned a document, he had burned what it contained himself, his complicity, his faith. Pike watched me, perhaps guessing some fragment of my thought. He said there had been another visitor, a woman. She had come 2 nights before the fire. I asked her name, though I already knew. He nodded once, as though confirming a verdict he'd hoped to avoid. She had asked if sins could be shared. He told her they could be forgiven. She'd smiled sadly, he said, and replied that forgiveness was only another kind of forgetting. After he left me alone, I sat in one of the pews. The church was utterly still, the kind of silence that magnified the smallest sounds, the ticking of the clock above the door, the faint drip of rain from the eaves. I thought of Eleanor's handwriting in the margins, of the words she had written over remember, of the graves that bore no name. Every truth in this case had been rewritten, revised, redacted, all for the sake of peace that could never quite be earned. When I finally stepped outside, the sky was turning the colour of tarnished silver. Lewis was waiting by the gate. He asked what I'd found. I told him nothing that would stand up in court and everything that would stand up in conscience. He looked puzzled, but said nothing more. We parted there by the wall of the graveyard. I watched him go, his coat disappearing into the mist. Then I turned back toward the church and noticed something I had missed before, a faint scorch mark along the stone ledge beneath one of the stained glass windows, shaped like the curve of a hand. It was impossible to tell whose. As I stood there, a line from the Psalms came to me, "Unbidden, our God is a consuming fire." I could not recall whether it was meant as warning or comfort. I lit a cigarette, inhaled the smoke, and thought how alike the two scents were, fire and faith, both cleansing, both cruel. And as the first bells of morning began to sound across Oxford, I knew that whatever had burned at St. S., the college library, had always struck me as a place that pretended to guard its secrets while quietly feeding on them. When it reopened that November morning, after weeks of investigation and silence, it felt less like a reopening than a resurrection, the kind that leaves its ghosts precisely where they were. Lewis said it was just another building. I said that every building in Oxford keeps its own conscience, and some refuse to let it go. He didn't reply, but the way he looked around that small, reluctant awe told me even he felt it. The air still carried the faint scent of varnish and damp paper, and the dust motes drifted like suspended thought in the light. We were there to examine Leland's remaining notes, the ones recently recovered from a forgotten storage box. They had been found behind a row of dictionaries, an irony I suspect Leland would have enjoyed. The librarian, a discreet woman with a careful voice, said they'd been catalogued under miscellaneous theology, though nothing within seemed remotely divine. The box was small, wooden, its lock broken. Inside, scraps of paper, lecture drafts, half-written letters, and, tucked between them, a folded sheet that bore the familiar, angular hand. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't even finished, just a paragraph written as if to no one or to someone already dead. We study faith to measure its absence, not its presence. To know what light means, one must first live among ruins. Lewis said it sounded poetic. I said it sounded tired. He asked if I thought it meant anything. I told him everything means something. That's the trouble with words. We spent an hour in that stillness, reading what could be read, discarding what couldn't. The radiator hissed softly like something breathing. Outside, the wind pressed faintly against the windows. The world went on. A slip of paper fell from one of the drafts, a note written in another hand, Eleanor's. The same looping script I had seen in the margins of his books. "Leave it with me. I will do what must be done." I felt Lewis watching me as I read. He said it proved she'd known more than she'd admitted. I said proof was a word for men who lack imagination. He smiled, the sort of smile that half invited argument, half surrendered to futility. When he left to fetch tea, I stayed behind. The room was too quiet, and in that quiet, memory rearranged itself. I noticed, for the first time, the shelf where the box had been found. The dust along its edge was disturbed in two places, once recently and once long before. There was a faint outline of something rectangular, wider than the box itself. Another container perhaps removed before the discovery. On impulse, I checked the catalogue ledger by the desk. One entry caught my eye, MS-314, withdrawn indefinitely. The accession number had been crossed out, but beside it was a faint pencil note, barely legible. Transferred to St. Swithin's, 1989, a small deduction perhaps, but enough to stir the embers. I realized then that whatever Fairfax and Leland had been protecting had not perished in the fire at all. It had merely been displaced like guilt, like faith. Lewis returned with 2 paper cups and a look that implied I'd been thinking too long. I told him we were finished for now. He looked relieved. Outside, the bells began to toll the hour deep, resonant, unhurried. As we walked back through the quadrangle, the rain began again, thin and steady. A group of students hurried past us, laughing, their umbrellas colliding like careless arguments. I watched them vanish beneath the archway and thought of how easily knowledge becomes repetition, how each generation mistakes its discoveries for truth. Lewis asked if I believed the case was truly over. I told him the endings were for novels and sermons. What we deal in are merely pauses. That night I returned to my flat and placed Leland's final note on my desk beside the crossword. 5 down 7 letters that survived the fire. I filled it in without hesitation. Ashes. And for once, I didn't bother to check if it fit.